Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're the Association for the Chronically Mentally Ill, and our webinar is now about to begin. Oh, let me go on presentation mode. I just have a few slides. Again, this is a conversation with Dr. Kenneth Paul Rosenberg, the author of Bedlam, and an intimate journey into America's mental health crisis. The information is not presented as not medical advice. Please mute your lines when you're not asking a question, and you can submit questions in the chat window, or if you want to ask in person, you can also say that you'd like to ask in person and I'll call on you. So just put that through chat as well. If you would require a certificate of attendance, just send your information to contact@acmionline.com and you will get that certificate. Let's see. Oops. Once again, ACME is made up of a group of family members and passionate advocates that are working to change legislation. And here is our board, many of which will be on the call tonight as well. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Rosenberg, who is a psychiatrist that was motivated to become a psychiatrist after a family experience, which he can speak about more. And you'll give, if you read the book, which is a great book, both Chuck and I have read it and we've seen the film, but it gives you a really good insight into what led to this? What are the historical, political, and economic forces that resulted in what we have today? And it's not really a deinstitutionalization, it's a reinstitutionalization into our jails and our prisons. So with that, would you like me to go ahead and, let me escape here, and show the video trailer?
Yeah, absolutely, please. And then I'll mute myself while you do that. So this is a trailer from the film Bedlam that we made for PBS, shown at Sundance Film Festival. And it's available on Amazon and all places like that now.
Okay, let's see how this goes. I had to switch to a speaker to allow it to, so you could hear it. So hopefully this works this time.
Very busy.
Mental illness is not something people want to hear. It's not something they want to talk about.
I'm calling from LAC USC. I was calling because we have a female here. She's here in our psych ER.
The state of mental illness in this country is beyond the trite notion of crisis. It's at a point of comedic absurdity. The number of people that we just completely given up on. It's just staggering.
A lot of people down here suffer from mental health issues, and that's why they're down there. You know, I suffer from it, and these people suffer from it, and there ain't no help nowhere. It's just sad.
We have historically not fought for people with mental illness. And people are rising up and saying, we are sick and tired of our families being thrown away.
As long as doctors tolerate these working conditions and the outside world won't know what's going on, then nothing will ever get better. The definition of insanity is repeating the same thing over and over and expecting different results. The way we treat mentally ill in this country is insane.
I'm afraid that's the system.
Okay.
So with that, would you like to, I'm introducing Dr. Rosenberg and he can take it from here.
Great. So yeah, so I think that what Lori and Chuck and I spoke about is that we would basically take questions and we'd have a dialogue, certainly with Lori and Chuck at the helm. But I just want to say it's really an honor to be here. Whenever I come to an event that has family members like myself in it, I feel very much at home. And Lori and Chuck, you've made me feel that way in our conversation. And so, you know, I salute you and your organization. So thanks for having me. So what you just saw is a trailer from the film. The film has been shown pretty much, you know, all over the country, all over the world. A lot of NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness chapters have shown it. Even during COVID, there's a NAMI chapter in, I think it was Madison, that rented out a drive-in. And they had a drive-in screening. It's been used by a lot of people in the mental health world. Kamala Harris, when she put her platform together, quoted the book widely, and I was very honored that we were the major folks who she quoted in her platform. I hope she'll use it someday, you know. It's really been a great trip making this film, because when I made the film originally for HBO. I'm a psychiatrist, addiction psychiatrist in New York City at Cornell. And I've made 2 films previously for PBS, 4 films for HBO. And I thought when I made this film, I would be in the emergency room for a couple of weeks and I'd make a film, and that would be that. And I'd have a film about the psychiatric emergency room, which I've made several films, but never made that kind of film. But it became very apparent to me that that was not, as you all know, that's not the whole story. That's just a piece of the story. That's just a glimpse of what life is like in the emergency room. But I realized that the whole story was really following people, patients, if you will, over the course of time. The real story was really living with families. So I spent 5 years making the film that I thought would really take 2 weeks to make or 4 weeks to make. And I realized at some point that I needed to tell my own story, which is that my sister lived and died from schizophrenia. And that's not a story that I shared almost with, I mean, much with anyone. Even my children and my partner, Lynn, learned so much about me and my sister from watching the film and reading the book. So, you know, here we are 7 years later, really a decade later after I even conceived of the idea. And the film was shown at Sundance. It surprised me that it got accepted to Sundance, but it surprised me even more that we were the first film that they ever recall showing about serious mental illness, which I take as both a bad sign and a good sign. I mean, a bad sign because, you know, we are the most prevalent of illnesses with mental illness, and we get the least attention, the least funding. That's true, you know, across the board. But I take it as a good sign that things are changing, and I think really partly because of the work that you all are doing and our presence here, you know, things are changing. So I take that as a very good sign. So I could go on, but I think that Lori and Chuck, I think that probably we should just have more of a dialogue and talk about the film and the book and anything else y'all want to talk about.
So my first question was, how were you able to follow the individuals for years? That was really quite remarkable, how we could see people's journey from their first psychotic break and then see them through the years and see how it was a very cyclic cycle. And it wasn't just one and done, you know, it was.
Well, I think, yeah, that's why I said originally it's going to be one and done, as you say, but that really would not give an accurate depiction of what we as family members know, what patients struggle with every day. How did I do it? I mean, I collaborated with folks. You know, it took us literally 2 years to get permission to film in the emergency room. We had the entire board of supervisors vote on it, and tons of lawyers vet our process. I mean, our process is very simple. We get consents over and over and over again. And we get consents from the family as well as the patients. And you know, it's the most informed consent, but we really had to prove that. So it took a while to get permission to film or get the full access. And once we were there, you know, we found a couple of people who were really interesting. We filmed over 60 people, but there were a couple who I thought would be really interesting to follow. And we just stuck with them, you know. I mean, that's my job as a documentary filmmaker. As a psychiatrist, for better or for worse, I know when trouble is brewing. I know when things are going to happen. I have a sense of that. As a filmmaker, it's my job to use that to be able to tell the drama and the story and the trajectory of the illness. So we just, I mean, it's kind of the beautiful thing about documentary filmmaking. That's a very, very organic process. And, writing the book is the same way. I didn't set out knowing what I would say or who the characters would be. One of the first characters we filmed, you see him and his sister in the film, is Monty, and Monty's sister, Patrice. And Monty introduced me to Patrice, because again, we asked family members if it's okay, not just the patients. And Patrice said, I'm an activist and trying to change things. I said, that's great. I hope something comes of it. We follow her. And lo and behold, she co-founds Black Lives Matter, which is founded in large measure to help people just like her brother, people with serious mental illness. And, as we all know, people of color suffer even more so than the rest of the population with these illnesses and with the stigma. And also, when the police are called, of course. And that's why Black Lives Matter was founded by her, co-founded by her. She's now the executive director of Black Lives Matter and probably the #1 activist in the area of civil rights and mental health in the world. But, I had no idea that she was just this person I found in the emergency room. So, you just kind of meet people and collaborate with them and find them. One guy, Todd, I found him, he was very, very hard to track down. I had to, literally go to homeless shelters and talk to folks in Los Angeles and go to Skid Row and say, we're trying to find this guy, Todd. Here's his picture. Can you help us? Mail him letters. They get mail, they get sent back. But eventually, we were able to track him down through people in the shelter system. But, it took a lot of work, but it was certainly a labor of love, right?
Here's a question that came in via text. What are the biggest challenges to the behavioral health system today, in your opinion, as a psychiatrist?
Oh, that's this.
Not an easy one.
What are the biggest challenges? Obviously, the criminalization of people with serious mental illness is the biggest challenge, or something needs to be changed. We see that actually in the film. We see that in the book. We actually witnessed that being changed in Los Angeles. We witnessed Los Angeles going from being the epicenter of the crisis to being kind of an epicenter of change. So we really see that. So I think criminalization will be at the top of my list, that, our 3 largest mental institutions are our 3 largest jails. That's at the top of the list. The need for community health services, I would put right up there. The usual things, the need for assisted outpatient treatment, mental health courts diversion from the criminal system to the treatment system, wraparound services so that when a judge says, we're going to send you to treatment, there is a treatment to be sent to. I thought that would be, that's great. But I think the underestimated and underdiscussed thing that needs to change are the therapeutics. A lot of people don't want to take their medicines, and we say they have anosognosia, which is true. They all know they're ill, which is often true. The disease is taking over their brain and preventing them from cooperating, which is sometimes true. But it's also true that the medicines are really pretty imperfect, and they cause some very difficult side effects, lethargy, metabolic syndromes. I'm sure all of you know that, which is, diabetes and diabetes-like problems. People gain weight from the medicines. So I think the therapeutics really need to change. I make a big point about this in my book because, lithium, which is a wonderful treatment, I use it often. It's the gold standard for bipolar care, was discovered by accident, through serendipity, through an Australian psychiatrist who didn't know what the heck he was doing. He came up with a brilliant idea. He had no idea why. He had some cockamamie idea that he would neutralize the urine of a bipolar person. He experimented in rats. He had no idea what he was doing, but he came up with lithium, thank God. And that is now our gold standard. But psychiatrist Dr. Cade, I think his name was, came up with lithium in 1949. That's our gold standard. I mean, really? You know, God forbid you have breast cancer, you have HIV, you know, you develop COVID, as we were just talking about. You don't get treatment from 1949, do you? So I think that the therapeutics really need to be advanced, because at the end of the day, there's a lot that needs to change about our system, about our healthcare, about where people are put, and where they're treated and how they're treated. But it's mainly about the disease. And so I think we need a better understanding of the disease and better therapeutics.
I may call on my husband. So Chuck Goldstein, or Dr. Goldstein, as a medical doctor, he had a really good analogy that he gave at a Columbia mental health talk. Do you want to share that, Chuck? How that came to you?
Well, by virtue of the fact that I want to continue our relationship, I will gladly jump in here, even though you surprised me as usual. And what I basically said was I made an analogy between, well, everybody knows that that serious mental illness in its manifold forms is a long-term, lifelong term, in most cases, a chronic disease. So I used to think about the treatment with all of the different, whether it was therapeutics or the sociologic implications of the disease, in terms of chronic diseases like diabetes, congestive heart failure, COPD. These are long-term things that have to be maintained with drugs. But there's an essential difference between serious mental illness as a chronic disease and those others, because if somebody that you know has cancer or has congestive heart failure, you're going to bake them a nice pie and you're going to deliver it to their doorstep and say, I hope this makes you feel better. But when it comes to serious mental illness, nobody wants to know from you. Okay. And so I was thinking, now what chronic disease really mirrors the way society feels about people with serious mental illness? And what I came up with is leprosy. So if you're a leper, back in the days before we knew how to treat leprosy, society shunned you. It shunned you because you were sick, parts of you were falling off, you were rotting, and society did its best to exclude you from mainline society. In Hawaii, they put you all on the island of Molokai, if you guys remember back then. And the way society views serious mental illness is much like it viewed leprosy, which is that the symptoms of the disease. And in leprosy, it's just what I just described. It's serious mental illness. It's psychotic breaks. Nobody wants to experience the symptoms, and nobody feels benign towards you when you're exhibiting those symptoms. Very much alike in the two things. So for much of the 1800s and into the early 1900s, this was the state of affair. It probably went back for hundreds of years or longer than that people treated people who got the disease leprosy in much the same way that they treated people with serious mental illness. They excluded them, they looked down on them, they shunned them. And the nice people, the good people, probably church people back in those days, would try to make the lepers feel better. They would get them housing, they would feed them and try to make things better. But basically, there was nothing to be done for them. Everything they did was symptomatic relief. What happened is, with the advent of antibiotics and a particular course of therapy that involved 3 different antibiotics, we cured leprosy. And now if I was to tell you tomorrow that I had leprosy, you would say, well, you better go see the doctor. And that's all you would think about it, because we know how to cure leprosy. There's no more stigma attached to the disease. Well, that's what we need for serious mental illness. We need a cure, because everything Dr. Rosenberg is talking about is merely symptomatic relief. That's what it is. We're just putting Tylenol on a disease here and trying to control the symptoms. So with a bunch of other people, I'm chairman or co-chairman of a Columbia University Council that is for the advancement of research in global mental research and development of a cure. And I know it can be done. So I just wanted to say that as much as I appreciate what you're saying, Dr. Rosenberg, about making the therapeutics that are used for serious mental illness better, it's still just symptomatic relief in my case.
Yeah, I can agree with you more. I mean, I think that's absolutely what, I don't think it's any accident that we're both physicians and we're both saying, you know, we have to deal with the criminalization issue. We have to deal with the stigma issue, but we really have to deal with it. At the end of the day, it's the disease. You know, what I see is there's a lot of vilifying that goes on in our field, right? And they used to blame parents. That was like the worst thing to do. You know, your child's sick. And now the psychoanalysts in the 1950s would blame parents. Nowadays, I think we do, you know, scapegoat lots of people, psychiatrists, police, so forth and so on. I think at the end of the day, which all of them are imperfect, admittedly, but I think at the end of the day, the real problem, and I think we completely agree on this, there's no disagreement whatsoever, is there's a disease which needs to be treated better. And I couldn't agree with you more. To get treated better, you have to get to the core. It's complicated in something like schizophrenia, because schizophrenia is not one disease, but many diseases. You know, where the diagnoses of bipolar, schizophrenia, borderline, whatever it is, are made phenomenologically. They're not made because you see a blood test or a brain scan. But when we get to that point, things will progress, you know, much more. So right now, what we call schizophrenia is probably several different kinds of diseases that, you know, come together and conspire together. And also the other factor in mental illness, which is true in medical illnesses, is the social factors. You know, mental illnesses are very much influenced by social factors. Poverty is a risk factor, is a known risk factor for mental illness. People who are poor do worse, they have more stress, they have fewer options in life. Trauma, repeated trauma, the trauma of, you know, prejudice, structural racism, so forth and so on. That is a factor in mental illness. Certainly a big factor, again, a thing that's not discussed usually, that I you know, always like to talk about, is substance abuse. We talk about the homeless population. Well, the homeless, you know, I just did an interview today with Forbes. I mean, you know, and I constantly talk about this. You know, the homeless population, it seems, but based on the clinical data, that about 80% of the homeless population has a problem with substance abuse. And we know that substance abuse opens up a window on mental illness of all kinds, particularly serious mental illness, but any kind, a window that would otherwise be closed. So I think that substance abuse is also something we need to address. So I think it's great we're having this kind of dialogue, and it's exactly what I wanted. Laurie said, you know, how should we do this? We should do questions in the chat. And I was like, no, we should really talk as a group, because you're all really smart, and I think we could. It's just more, you know, just much more real. But I think that in terms of the illness, we do need a cure for the illness, but it's complicated because of the social factors, the drug factors, and that the illness is now defined phenomenologically, not biologically. And when we get to the biological definition, the biological diagnosis, then we'll really be so far further.
We have a hand up. So Dr. Franczak, who is a psychologist here and does a lot of work nationally. Mike, do you want to ask your question?
Well, one thing that I found is that one of the essential requirements of good care is making sure the person has housing, but not only housing, but the supports to succeed in that housing. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, your screen is off, so we've communicated by email. So at some point, I hope to see you. So thank you for that question, and thanks for facilitating this. You know, there's a lot of data that says that housing is a key issue. You see, when we look at the problems of the homeless, mentally ill, of course, housing is a problem, and we don't see those places in the deserts. Those problems in the desert of Arizona. We see those problems in major cities where there's a housing crisis. In Los Angeles, in New York. New York now has a policy that everyone could get some housing. Los Angeles doesn't have such a policy. And as a consequence, I think that's why in Skid Row, we see the largest accumulation of homeless and homeless mentally ill in the nation. It's not at a clubhouse or a community center, it's in the streets of Skid Row. So, there's a lot of data that done in Los Angeles, a project called Project 50, and it's been replicated over and over again, in which they took the sickest people in Los Angeles, sickest people they could find, and just gave them housing. They didn't demand they comply with treatment, which I think they should. They didn't demand that they were sober, which I think they should. But they just said, we're just going to put a roof over your head so you have a stable place to live. And they saw that those people did much better, saved the city a lot of money in emergency rooms, in hospital visits, certainly in jail visits. I mean, it's terribly expensive to keep someone in jail. It could cost, I think $80,000 a year. So, we see that, and that doesn't include the cost of the drugs that people need if they have psychiatric illness in jail. We see that housing first is a reasonable idea. And yes, I think that if you don't have housing, you're nowhere. Now, there's been a backlash against that recently because people are saying, well, you can't just give someone housing. You need to demand that they are getting well. You can't, and I think there's credibility in that position. If you give someone housing, you will help them, you will save money, you'll do all those good things. But to go further, I think you need to ensure some level of compliance with treatment, not to control their lives, but so they're not hearing voices, or as often happens, so they're not doing crystal meth. Because how well can they do? Their housing is going to fall apart if they're dealing drugs. If they get a home, and that home becomes a place to deal and do drugs, it's not going to help anyone. So housing first is I think very important, but I do think it needs to be attached to some kind of level of responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's our finding as well. We started out with a housing first model, but now we've come to conclude, and Chuck and this group agree, that we call it housing always, which means that a person gets the kind of supports to succeed, because we've seen so many people experience exactly what you're talking about. They go into housing without supports and they fail and they're evicted. And that isn't good for anyone.
Yeah, I love that housing always. That's great.
We had one of our two psychiatrists that presented about a month or two ago. They were talking about the co-occurring and how frequent it is. And what they were saying, we had one doctor that ran a first episode and another doctor that was an ACT team doctor. So kind of two extremes. And the ACT team doctor, for the same diseases, the first episode could give micro doses of antipsychotics versus the one that was treating ACT members had to give mega doses. And if you added meth, they said meth always wins. We can't give enough to overcome meth. We can give enough to overcome a little pot and a little different things, but that was her same conclusion, that until people will stop, especially meth, it's really difficult to have any level of recovery.
Yeah, I think recovery really, I'm a strong believer. I'm probably on the far end of this, but I really believe recovery from mental illness requires abstinence from substance abuse. And I would say all substances to be on the safe side. What I often say to my patients is my drugs really can't compete with your drugs. Your drugs are way more powerful, and I don't know what the hell they're doing to you, and I don't know how they're going to interfere with, and I don't know how much they're going to cause a problem for you. I had one patient who I saw, again, I'm an addiction psychiatrist. I don't treat people with schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. That's not my specialty. My specialty is addiction psychiatry. As you said earlier, I came to this because my family member has schizophrenia. But, I had one patient as an addiction psychiatrist who came to me who really had the signs of schizophrenia. And this person had done very well in life, but spent their, junior year abroad in Amsterdam.
Mm.
And being in Amsterdam, they smoked a lot of weed there. And long story short, it took them another decade of hard work and treatment and therapy and medication so they could go back and go to their senior year. Between their junior year and an Ivy League college and their senior year, it took a decade. They got better, but I think that's an example, clinical example, if you will, but I think a valid one nonetheless, of how substance abuse can open up a window onto serious mental illness that might otherwise be closed.
So we had a couple notes about the film, and I felt the same way. We are not new to this being exposed to people with serious mental illness. So I thought I was really not going to be that impacted by the film. And I was really surprised how impacted I was. I mean, I thought I had been in enough psych hospitals with my loved ones to have seen it all. And it really just, it was gut wrenching. It wasn't a popcorn movie, right? And others have said, even though they've seen it 5 times, it's still, they weep every time, and it's harder every time because you can really so identify with the stories and almost a predictable, like, okay, I think I'm better. I'm not going to take my meds. Okay, now they're moving out and they're gone. And whenever you don't hear from someone a while, I know for us, it's like, that's not a good sign, right?
No, I made a film. So the book is less so. The book is really gets low into policy things and more into history and talks about asylums a little bit. But I made the film really to be just that, to really give a real bird's eye view of just how bad it gets, not how good it gets, because it does get good, and there's many happy stories out there. But for for the population I was looking at, the population in the emergency room, the population that's often homeless, the population that lacks resources, people of color, as I say in particular, it's a really, it's an American tragedy. And I really wanted to show that. I have to say, I have a hard time watching the scenes that I'm in. I put myself in the film. I went to the home that I grew up in, where my sister was very, very ill, where she jumped out of the window and nearly killed herself, and that home became a hovel. And it was quite a hard thing for me to go. And I think the first time it showed in Sundance, I think I watched it, but at Sundance, they repeat these films like 10 times. I would always walk out during that scene because it's hard to watch, but I really feel that it's something that everyone should see. This is a problem that doesn't spares few families, and as hard as it's to look at, I think we have to look at it in order to say this is an American problem and we really need to face it.
Now, Allie had made a comment, and if she's on, she may have dropped, but she's talking about a big study about to take off on schizophrenia meds. Hopefully it will yield some positive outcomes, also part of the stigma and discrimination in treatment. So I'm not sure, Allie, if you're on, if you wanted to tell us a little bit about it, that'd be interesting.
Yeah.
And if not, we'll wait till she pops back on.
I'll say, because as we talk about, we've lost a lot of beds, but we also have lost a lot of research. One of the reasons why, there's several reasons why we focus, the NIMH is focusing on early intervention. One, it's the right thing to do. You want to treat, as we all know, you want to treat someone when they're less ill, you could have much more of an impact. And as you said earlier, they need less drugs, they have a much better prognosis. The earlier in any disease process you intervene, the better. But the other reason why we're focusing on first episode and early intervention is because, we haven't really not had many new candidate drugs to look at. So, Fuller Torrey has looked at this, tells me based on his research that the number of drug trials for schizophrenia has vastly decreased by something like 90% over the past decade to 15 years. So the fact that I think that I want to hear about the new drug trials, but I think that's one of the things that Chuck and I were talking about earlier, that we really need to understand the diagnostics and the therapeutics much, much better.
Now, Janet had a good question about jails and forensic hospitals and patients that are violent. And I'm chair of the oversight at Arizona State Hospital. So I get to read the incident and accident reports, and I see it's always difficult controlling. It seems like it's really difficult to control patients that have a real prone or tendency towards violence. And Janet, do you want to ask your question and see if Ken has any knowledge about the best hospitals or human design features?
Yeah, so, I get crisis calls all the time, and, family members get their loved ones into hospitals, but it seems like all of the hospitals that are offering civil hospitals that are offering treatment now, if the patient becomes violent, they're just like, there's nothing we can do with you, because the hospitals lack the design features needed in order to be able to provide humane and therapeutic treatment and care to someone like. So I have this recent individual who's on the autism spectrum, has schizoaffective disorder and severe PTSD, who's resistant to treatment, lashes out. So the doctors where we got her hospitalized said, we can deal with the schizoaffective disorder, but as far as her jumping up on the tables and throwing furniture around and disrupting the entire hospital, we can't treat that, and recommendation was she probably needs to be in one of our state psychiatric hospitals, which for most people is a lifetime stay. And the poor girl's only 28 years old. So there's just not enough middle rungs on the ladder for someone like her that has design features that's secured, but to be able to treat her autism, her schizoaffective disorder, and like literally severe PTSD. So that she's, there long enough to be able to start to deal with her issues. She's just running. She assaults people. Anyway, they put her on a bus to Maryland. She somehow made it to Maryland. It's crazy. You look at the video on her. Stop. You look at the video on the bus that she put on her Facebook page. Sorry for my puppy. She was meowing, and clearly psychotic on the bus, but somehow they let her go all the way to Maryland, and her dad got her. The next day she's in a crisis center. He's trying to take her to the crisis center. She jumped out of the car and then got on a train, flew to Chicago, ended up getting kicked out of her aunt's house, spent the night on the wrong side of the tracks in Indiana. Somehow she called her mom. Mom bought her a ticket back to Maryland where her dad is. She's in a hospital now. She called me yesterday morning. I don't think I was very much help, but I said, she's like, why am I here? They keep holding me hostage. And I said, well, Mario, why do you think you're there? They can't hold you in the hospital unless you're dangerous to yourself or others or gravely disabled. And she said, I don't know, doctor, why am I in the hospital? And you could hear the doctor in the background saying, because you assault people. She hit a medical, she hit an ER nurse. She hits her family. When she was in the jail here, we pried her out of a horrible jail in Louisiana after she was there for 9 months unmedicated. She hit everybody in the jail. So you can imagine she was on 3 months of disciplinary lockdown. This is a really problematic individual, but we did get her into a good hospital once we got her sprung from the jail. But they couldn't do anything for her because the hospital simply lacks those design features. The only places that have design features where they can keep people safe from themselves or others are jails and forensic hospitals. And jails are not, they are not able to treat people with anosognosia because they don't force treatment. So they live in these solitary cells with active delusions, auditory and visual hallucinations, and then everyone's wondering why they're trying to kill themselves. So my question really was, are there any hospitals in the United States today or anywhere in the world that have good design features that are able to keep people safe from themselves and others and therapeutically help them without them being incarcerated or having to commit a crime to get into a forensic hospital. Because if there are, I want to know, because I want to see the blueprints, because I'm trying to design something, you know, like that, if it's even possible. I don't know.
Well, you know, Janet, first of all, hi, it's nice to see you again. And I mean, I have not visited enough forensic hospitals. Last time I was at a forensic hospital was when I trained at Bellevue. And, you know, I was at a hospital here in New York City called Manhattan State, and they had a forensic hospital there. And you know, so I don't know exactly what's going on today. I know that, you know, violence is a real issue. Our dear departed friend DJ used to talk about that all the time. He used to say, you know, the truth is people with serious mental illness do commit acts of violence more than the rest of the population. Absolutely, they're more often the victims than the perpetrators, but still there's a fair amount of violence. And as DJ used to say, you just talk to any person in the ER about that and you can find out. You know, the data is that over 50% of staff in an emergency room, in a psychiatric emergency room, have been assaulted by, you know, a psychiatric patient. So we know that violence is a real issue. Violence is super interesting though, because we also know it's a cultural issue. So the answer to your question is I don't know of any place that does it well. And I think the forensic hospitals, I don't know, I haven't visited them in depth. I can't opine on those. But there is something interesting to say about the violence, about it being a cultural issue. So for instance, in the UK and Italy, you know, you and I talk about Trieste a lot, we talk about the UK a lot. You know, there's very little, you know, of tying people down to a gurney, injecting them with medication. Now, is that the population, or is that the patient population, or is that the treater population? I think it's a bit of both, frankly. You know, Ellen Sachs, who many of you know, she's in my book, and she's just, you know, a wonderful person. For those, if anyone doesn't know her, you should read her book and see her TED Talk. Ellen is a person with schizophrenia who is also a MacArthur Fellow, also a professor at USC Law School, and she's just fantastic. And we talk about her in the book quite a bit. You know, and Ellen said to me, you know, when I was first diagnosed, thank God, she says, I was diagnosed in the UK when she was at Cambridge, I believe. And when she was diagnosed, she was, you know, treated in an emergency room, but not tied down, not restrained, not injected against her will. And when she came to Los Angeles, she was tied down, injected, and treated against her will. Same person. I don't know, maybe she was in a different state. I can't, but she says, had she, you know, Ellen, as many of you know, if you know her or read her book, she's a big fan of treatment. She's a big fan of psychodynamic psychotherapy twice a week, and a big fan of Clozaril. You know, and those are the treatments I think I'm pretty sure she publicly says. We say in the book, so it's now public information, and she's blessed the book many times over. So I have no qualms telling you that. But she says, you know, her collaborative stance towards psychiatry would not exist if she were treated first in Los Angeles. It was only because she was treated first in the UK. So there is a cultural component. There is something to be said about, you know, how we respond to people with, you know, serious mental illness.
So several years ago, I was at a Columbia Behavioral Health conference at Fountain House. And it was interesting because I met a doctor, a psychiatrist from Trieste. And at that time, we were looking at IMD exclusion laws and everything else. So I said to the psychiatrist, I said, so how many locked psychiatric beds do you have in your community, in your public hospital? And he looked at me and he said, we don't have locked psychiatric beds. So I said, well, what do you do if someone's really out of control and the police take them and they go? And he said to me, he said, if the police have to interact with one of my patients, that means I'm not doing my job. They would call, I would go to the jail, I would sit with my patient until I stabilized them and got them feeling better, and then we would both go home. I mean, it was such a different I kept questioning more and more because it was hard to believe, but they're trying to do the Trieste model in LA now. I don't know how that's going.
Yeah, they're releasing funding. It's going to be a while till that begins. Carrie Morrison, who many of you know, is kind of spearheading that effort. John Sharon, who's the head of DMH, is also very involved in that. Yeah, Trieste is fantastic, and yeah, they had 3 beds to the best of my knowledge, but they have, the guy who runs the place says they have hardly any use for that. Trieste is a different place. That you can't do in Rome what you do in Trieste, right? I mean, Trieste is a town, 220,000 people. Universal health care, no drug epidemic, close-knit families. But still, as we say, it's not just the patient population, it's the culture of the treatment providers that is markedly different. And, we're trying to do that. Now in New York, they just have passed a rule where they have CIT, crisis intervention teams, go out with the police, social workers, go out with the police. We know from many models that the police often interact best with people with serious mental illness when they don't look like or act like police, when you don't see their guns, when they don't have uniforms, when they don't have police cars, when they're not trying to, dominate. Sometimes you need that, but the kind of domination of the police is often a real problem and escalates, as we saw with, Daniel, I want to say Purdue, I think that's not his name. What's his name? The unfortunate man who died in Rochester. So we see how things escalate very, very quickly. In our film, we have a family talk about how they called the police and their son was tased to death in front of their very eyes. So, those things, those are real problems. Again, not just because of the patients are different, but because of the culture of the providers here in this country. It needs to be changed.
So Karen has a question.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg, for writing the book. It occurred to me that back in the 80s, couldn't be the 90s. I'm 71, so I can't tell how many years ago. But when we first found out that smoking caused cancer, and it took a lot of effort and a lot of advertising, and we had, insurances would pay for groups to go in, and we really made that a national health crisis. Was all the cancer from smoking. And I'm just wondering if it would help the stigma and help families to realize it's okay and normal if we could make mental illness a national health problem, a national health crisis, and where we could really get community involvement, lots of advertising. I mean, to let people know it's okay to say someone has a mental illness. It's normal. It's normal. We know that I think it affects 1 out of every 5 people. And, I was listening to you talk about your film and the book, and I'm actually writing a book, and it's called I Wish My Son Had Cancer. And then I put, oh, did I just say that out loud? And I said, when you have cancer or something like that, the casseroles come in, what can I do to help? Let me help you any way I can. When they find out that it's a mental illness, they're like, oh, okay, well, let's change the subject. Let's do this or that. But if we make it normal, if we make it acceptable, if we make it, that it's okay.
Yeah, I agree with you more. I mean, I think that, but it wasn't that long ago that, there was a war on cancer, right, that was started, back in the day, but it wasn't long ago that cancer was the C word. People didn't even say cancer. And I think that, you know, the destigmatization and taking away prejudice, because that's really what it comes down to, is
Right.
very, 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 very important. And we've seen that happen with other groups, other advocacy groups, other diseases, HIV, breast cancer, being fantastic examples of how, you know, advocates really, you know, Chuck and I were talking about treatment. Advocates really got new treatments, they got research to be a priority, but also got it kind of normalized. So, and it goes hand in hand, because when you have better treatments, people feel a little bit better about saying they have a disease, as opposed to saying something which, you know, in the 1950s, the image was in the snake pit, and or, you know, one flew over the cuckoo's nest and everyone gets institutionalized and no one ever gets better, which is, you know, far from the truth. But I couldn't agree with you more. I think that we need to, you know, make this a national priority, and we need to destigmatize it across the board. I think there's much reason for hope. I mean, you know, there's legislation constantly coming out, you know, since the parity bill and onward, that we see that people are becoming more aware and more accepting of mental illness. Children are much more willing to accept they have a mental illness in this generation than previous generations. They're much more willing to get medicines during recess than they ever were, and share with their friends. Kids post it, they say I have a bipolar disorder, I have schizophrenia. And I think a lot of credit goes to people like you all, frankly, you know, for organizations like this, which bring it out, put it out there. And you know, that's what we try to do in our film. And that's why people were in the film. People wanted to be in the film because they wanted to demonstrate to the world that we have a bad disease, we're not bad people. You know, we have a troubled family, but we're not a bad family. And, you know, we all know that, but I think that's the message that really needs to get out there.
Do you think that the current pandemic and people being at home and so many people showing signs of stress and mental health will help normalize it? On one hand, I don't want all the money to go to the worried well, right? And the ones that are anxious, which is typically what happens. You know, we want money to go for the serious mental illnesses, but maybe this will help show people that no one's immune, and even normal people, if put under extreme circumstance, can start showing signs of mental illness.
Yeah, I think people are talking about it much more. I think the COVID crisis is making it aware, but also the COVID crisis is making us aware that there's a biological basis to psychiatric illness. It's not just the stress. You know, that COVID is actually, people have a high likelihood of having a neuropsychiatric illness after, you know, a COVID episode, unfortunately. So I think COVID is, you know, COVID is going to really change a lot of things in terms of therapeutics, I think, in terms of awareness, in terms of research. You know, I think that is a terrible pandemic, terrible crisis for our world, but I think there will be medical research that comes out of it, and I think a fair amount of that will be neuropsychiatric. But I think your point, Laura, is very well taken. It will also increase, you know, awareness that mental illnesses could very easily strike. Charlene McCray, who's the First Lady of New York City, and I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post not too long ago about COVID and the need for mental health care, and the fact that there's a great need and awareness now of telepsychiatry. So, which kind of, you know, doing what we're doing now via Zoom, the telepsychiatry kind of democratizes treatment so that more people have access to treatment. So I think that's also another blessing, if there is one, you know, from this horrible pandemic, that people are now aware how easy it is to get help. And telepsychiatry, you know, developed because there used to be people in rural communities who had no access to psychiatry. Now everyone, you know, is finding telepsychiatry. In fact, I was in my office for a couple of days in New York City. I couldn't get a patient to come in. They were like, no, I like this telepsychiatry thing. I don't have to, you know, leave my house and get on a bus or take a cab to see you. So I think telepsychiatry really will.
Mama get it for you.
Be more aware.
Yeah, Mama get your dinner.
I was going to ask, we've had some questions about where can they see your film?
Yes, I'm sure it's going to stream again on pbs.org for free. Unfortunately, for a couple of dollars. You can buy it on Amazon, on Google Play, I mean, I think most of the TV on demand things, if you go to your, Amazon account, I'm not sure if it's Amazon Prime or not, but if you go to your Amazon account in your TV or your Apple TV, and you just hit Bedlam, you should be able to find it. And if you have any questions or any difficulty finding, the book is easy to find. That's available on Amazon and every other bookseller. If you have any trouble finding the film, please, send me an email, at our website, bedlamfilm.com. Bedlamfilm.com. There's a place where you could ask questions, and if you don't get an answer, just they could go to you, Lori, and Chuck, and you can send me the question, and we'll be sure to answer anything you have and help you find the film.
So one last question. When I see this all the time as I review incident and accident reports, when did we start calling the police on people in level 1 psychiatric hospitals or the public psychiatric state hospitals? It seems like now the police are involved a lot. And, I look at it like, well, they're in there because they're really, having symptoms and symptomatic. So when did that shift?
So, I'm sorry, your question is when did it shift that we called the police?
We call the police when a patient that's really symptomatic and violent assaults a staff member. I think in the old days, I never heard about it. And now they're there all the time.
All the time, yeah. I don't know the answer to that question, when that happens. But look, I think it's part of the trend we've seen in America, right? Where, law enforcement is the new social workers, and judges are the new psychiatrists. And, we really have put mental illness, as you said earlier, we have not deinstitutionalized people, we've trans-institutionalized them. We've taken them from a treatment system which was inadequate to a criminal justice system which treats them even worse, and to the streets, which they have to fend for themselves. So I think that we have, by default, put the care of our loved ones into the hands of the criminal justice system and law enforcement.
Yeah. I think what's sad is that when people are looking for psychiatric beds and the police are involved all the time, they know that the jail never says we're out of beds, right? They don't have to call around. They don't have to go to urgent psychiatric and wait with the patient. If they take them to jail, they're done. Yeah. Which is
not in the ER, of course.
Oh yeah, Chuck could tell you about that. He used to say, they can turn a 40-bed trauma center into a 25-bed and have most of the staff diverted.
Well, yes, and you spoke earlier about the IND exclusion, which most of us, I assume, are in favor of getting rid of. But, what we show in the film is that they were going to build a 4,000-bed mental health jail. So why do we have to fight tooth and nail for 17 beds past the 16-bed limit, given the IMD exclusion? But it's very easy to build a 4,000-bed mental health jail. So again, I think that's part of the trend that I was talking about earlier, that we've moved the care of the mentally ill into the criminal justice system. And
we have to reverse that.
We have to reverse
it. There is something that, we're leaving out here, and that is that the intent was not to empty out the asylums and to direct them directly to the criminal justice system and put them in jails. There was actually supposed to be something called the behavioral health system. As it was actually thought of in the 60s and 70s, when it developed, it was going to be an outpatient system, and it was never funded, and it still isn't funded appropriately. If it was funded appropriately, all of these different areas that we talk about, the lack of inpatient beds, the lack of housing, the lack of appropriate screening agencies, so many things where the system breaks down are all part of an inadequate behavioral health system. And I must say, it reminds me very much of a scene from a favorite movie of mine, which is not a particularly good movie, but I love it. It's called Armageddon. And in this movie, they're actually going to be blasting off to destroy some meteor somewhere. And in a particular scene in there, Steve Buscemi turns to Bruce Willis as they're being strapped into this rocket and are about to blast off to do this job and destroy this meteor that's going to destroy the Earth. And he turns to him and he says, how does it feel to put all of your faith into a government project that's been built by the lowest cost bidder? Okay, so we are in that rocket ship. That rocket ship is our behavioral health system, and it's leaking air.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we talk about that a great deal in the book Bedlam and a great deal in the film, because right, it wasn't the community mental health system that President Kennedy, envisions with the best of intentions, was not properly funded, and it wasn't really capable of taking care of the sick people to begin with, frankly, to the best of my information. So that we never really had that kind of system, and then it was completely dismantled in the 1980s.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. It's been a pleasure. If we get more questions, I will forward them ahead. But thank you, everyone. And this will be recorded and loaded on our site in the next day or so. Thank you. Thank you, Ken.
Oh, pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.